Welcome to HR Voices, a podcast for independent HR and people professionals and the businesses they support. HR Voices is brought to you by the expert team at HR Independence Limited. We hope you enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of the HR Voices podcast. Today we thought, as we're heading into the end of the year, and there's been a lot of HR legislation, and we've had the budget, and we've had lots going on. It's been quite a busy year in the world of HR. So we thought it'd be really good to have a session today to have a bit of a look back at the past year and have a look forward to potentially what's coming maybe next year and beyond. So a bit of a year in review to get us all ready for the new year. And we're very kindly joined today by Amanda Trewhella from Freeths Employment Law, who are our employment law partner. And I am, as always, joined by my partner in crime, Mary Asante. So hi, Mary.
Hi, Charlotte. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, morning, bye.
Hi, Amanda. So, Amanda, first of all, so some of our members obviously will know you quite well because they'll have heard you talk in our sort of membership webinar platform. But for those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about you and who you are and what you do with Freeths.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I'm a director at Freeths and also an employment solicitor. Been there sort of 6 years, and Freeths are a full service law firm. So we offer not just employment law advice, of course, but all areas of law as well. And we've got offices across the country. As I say, I act for employers, advising on all areas of employment law advice, dealing with claims, day-to-day issues, policies, the whole shebang.
Great stuff. Sounds really interesting. And I know we rely on you a lot with HRI to keep us legal and sound. So thank you for that. So let's talk about, it's been a busy year. So let's talk about some of the stuff that's come through. What's your take on some of what's come through the system and the year that we've had so far?
Yeah, well, as you say, it's been a really busy one. And actually just thinking about it for doing this talk this morning, I've sort of started doing a list. There's so much that's happened. And I think, of course, on our minds at the moment is the Employment Rights Bill, because that was all very recent. But just through the whole year and around April, we've had a lot of change as well for people to keep up with.
Yeah, so we had a bit of a catch up from the pandemic, didn't we? Because we didn't have much during the pandemic, obviously, because Parliament wasn't really operating in the same way. So we had a bit of a purge in April.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think in April we had the carers leave coming in, sort of 1 week of unpaid leave for carers. I mean, we could probably talk in more depth about that and whether it's actually it goes as far as it should do for people that have caring responsibilities. But there we go. It's just 1 week of unpaid leave at the moment anyway. I think we also had the changes to flexible working were around the same time as well. So not too much change there, but it's now a day one right. And of course, if you believe the newspapers, they were sort of saying all the floodgates are going to be opening and everybody's going to be wanting to work a 4-day week, which I don't think in my experience it quite has happened, but that's a bit of a change there. There's obviously a shorter period as well that you've got to decide as to whether you allow flexible working, just 2 months now rather than 3. So a couple of changes there. And what else did we have in April? I think the changes to redundancy and maternity as well.
Yeah, more protection for maternity returners, wasn't there? And also those on family leave.
Yeah, exactly. So it's extended now to the period when somebody's pregnant and for generally about 6 months after they've returned as well from maternity leave, adoption leave, of course, and also shared parental leave as well.
I think that those are all, mostly family-friendly leave policies and laws and legislation that came in at the beginning of the year, isn't it? And I think for me personally, things such as the carers leave and the protection for people on maternity leave, etc., is a huge step. And I do agree with you in terms of did it go far enough? Maybe a conversation for a different day, but definitely a step in the right direction for people with caring responsibilities, especially, and also people on maternity leave who sometimes, I know the protection has been there for a while, hasn't it? Where you needed to consider them first for roles before, but it almost didn't go as far enough. And it was easier almost to bring them back into the fold after you can demonstrate that you have considered them.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the other one was paternity leave. I think that was also around April, wasn't it? Where partners can now have their 2 weeks as 2 separate weeks as well and take it over the first year of when the baby arrives as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one that I do agree perhaps hasn't gone far enough in the sort of the way it's implemented and paid for. And I think it's interesting when you see the reports that come out around that not many men or partners take up the paternity leave, but actually it comes back to the whole, again, conversation for another day, the whole sort of pay gap piece, because in most cases still probably there's a partner that's earning more than the other, and it's just not viable to be on statutory pay. And also 2 weeks is nothing, is it, to bond with a child?
Such a short period
Just
of
such a
time.
short time.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously they've not made changes yet to shared parental leave, but that's
No.
another one where it seems like a good idea, but to just receive statutory pay for most people is just not enough, and it's just not taken up very much at all.
I
No.
think overall as well is pretty much how these legislations translate into practical implementation and application within various businesses and within the working environments as well. Because I think most of the time, Charlotte and Amanda, you probably hear as well from your clients where people are really worried about the cost. Employers are worried about the cost of, okay, yes, I'm happy to give everyone a flexible working request, but I seriously need to consider the impact on my business in terms of would that translate into a job share for a particular job? Or would that actually mean that me bringing more people in generally so that I can cover for all the flexibility requests that is cost to employers? And also, if you think about carers leave, much as it's an unpaid leave for the carer, employers still have to think about how they cover the work that carer was meant to have been doing whilst they're on that carer's leave. So it's a really delicate art for employers, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. As you say, there's always a cost involved, even if it is just a little bit of short-term cover. And it's obviously most companies want to do the right thing, but as you say, they've got to weigh up what they can afford as well.
Well, they have to consider as well how their business operates and where their customers are and how their customers or clients operate, because I've had quite a few conversations with senior leaders talking about it's a great idea and it's all very well saying we have to pay more attention to try and approve these things, but actually it doesn't work for our business. And when a lot of the people are putting in requests that ask for working time, when our clients and our customers don't operate, or it's not convenient to the business, and they're going to struggle to do their job because there's nobody around to work with. There's so many things to consider, isn't there? So many strands to it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we do have to remember, as I said as well, there's been a lot in the headlines, I think, particularly about flexible working and 4-day week related as well to the Employment Rights Bill, which I know we'll come on to. But really not too much has changed. You've still got the 8 reasons that you can give to turn down a request. And if, like you say, it means that there's not going to be enough employees there for the time that your customers need people, then that's obviously a valid reason to turn the request down. So I wouldn't want companies to see the headlines and think, oh, we have to give people flexible working or a 4-day working week just because they ask. It's obviously got to work for the business as well and the rest of the team.
Yeah, I did see a little bit of panic actually with some of my own clients when they saw that come out. It definitely was a little bit headline grabbing, and I was explaining to them, no, this isn't actually much of a change. We've been doing these things for a while. There are some subtle changes, and yes, we do need to give consideration and due consideration, and try and negotiate and consult and find a path that works for everybody. But actually, I think there was some panic that people were going to have to suddenly start approving 4-day working weeks, when that wasn't really the case.
I think the key there, Charlotte, you've mentioned is the due consideration. Much as employers need to consider what worked for their businesses and for them, they also really need to consider the employee's request. because we find time and time again that sometimes some employees can say no for the sake of we can say no and we are going to say no without necessarily considering whether that request is reasonable, whether they can really accommodate it within their working environment, teams, etc. And I guess that is where employers really need to consider the benefits to them as an organization and to their workforce as well of flexible working and some of these legislative changes as well.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely positives as well if it's something you can do within your business, and it has to be right for your business, of course, but it definitely helps, of course. So many people now want to work flexibly. So if you can do that, you are going to attract people, and particularly in areas where recruitment's difficult as well. It's a real plus, I think, if you can do that and also advertise that you're willing to do it.
Yes, definitely puts you in the sort of competitive marketplace for recruitment, doesn't it now? Yeah. So we had handbook hell in April, trying to get everybody's policies and procedures up to date, working with all our clients, trying to pull them all back onto legally compliant and up to date with all the April stuff. And then we had an election with a promise within the first 100 days to change a whole heap of HR stuff. So, we've had the employment bill and they have delivered as promised. And that's seeing another raft of legislation and more changes. So we're going to be changing stuff again. So take us through some of the key highlights on the employment bill.
Well, I think that there's a lot of it. If you've had a read of the whole thing, it's 158 pages. Not that interesting.
58 pages.
It's a long document, but at the
Bedtime
moment,
reading.
Yeah, exactly. If you can't get to sleep. But it's very much, it's a skeleton of what they're planning to do. And as they've said, they're going to be consulting on all of the various issues. So it's likely to be quite a while before anything actually comes into force. So luckily, we've all got lots of notice as to what's probably going to change, and we can start planning and preparing. But I think the biggest one is in relation to unfair dismissal. Again, the headline is it's going to become a day one right. Which isn't strictly what they're doing. At the moment, of course, you've got to have 2 years service to claim unfair dismissal. It's that requirement that's going to be going. However, in its place, there's going to be something, we're not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but in relation to probation, there's going to be like a statutory scheme. It's looking like that's probably going to be 9 months, about 6 or 9 months, but it looks probably like 9 months. So what we think is going to be the case is that you'll have to follow some sort of defined process in that time. So rather than being able to just dismiss someone because you weren't happy with them in the first few months, it's probably going to be something like you have to hold a meeting with them. They've got to be allowed to bring a companion, give them their chance to have a say before making any decisions. So we are still going to have a period of time where you can be assessing new employees to see if they're working out. But beyond that, then they're going to have the right to claim unfair dismissal. So I think it's just going to be a real different mindset for employment lawyers, HR professionals, as to how we deal with things. Because, of course, for such a long time, we thought, well, if they don't have 2 years service and there are no other issues, it's fairly easy to dismiss somebody, of course, at the moment, as long as you've got some sort of fair reason. It's just going to be a bit different. And once that probationary period has passed, you're just going to have to make sure that you do follow a good process, whether it's poor performance process.
So do you think they'll extend the sort of ACAS code style approach into that probationary period? Because at the moment, we write and see a lot of policies where it says that within the probationary period, we won't necessarily follow the full disciplinary or capability process. We might do an abridged process because we don't have to. So do you think perhaps that sort of ACAS code approach will come into that probationary period?
I expect so, yeah. It's probably going to be something not quite as detailed. So in terms of performance management, if you think at the moment you've got to have quite a long period of time where you're having meetings, giving people an opportunity to improve and to understand what they need to do to get to that stage, it's going to have to be some sort of shortened version of that, I would imagine, because if it's only going to be a 6-month probationary period, it's got to be reasonable. But so far, we don't know what that looks like. So we've got to wait and see what comes out of the consultation. And they have said they don't expect this to come in before autumn 2026. So 2 years from now, I've got quite a long time to prepare.
So enough
Yeah.
time to really get our heads around it, prepare, train our managers, put policies
Absolutely.
in place, and to
Yeah,
be ready for when 2026 comes.
exactly.
But
And I think
I think there are aspects that will come into effect next year, isn't it? Such as the national minimum wage and things, which is due for April.
yeah, exactly. That wasn't under the Employment Rights Bill. That was separate. But yes, exactly. There's going to be quite a big jump again in April. So I think particularly for smaller businesses, that's quite an issue.
Yeah. And are there any aspects of the Employment Rights Bill that you think are imminent as people are thinking about, okay, the new year, their budgets, business plans and strategies, etc.? Are there aspects that for at least the next 12 months they need to worry about?
No, there's nothing that's imminent at all. As I say, they're looking to consult, and that's going to take time. And then it's obviously got to go through Parliament and become law. So it's unlikely anything substantial is going to be in before 2 years' time. But of course, it's still worthwhile companies, particularly with their planning ahead and looking at costs. There's different bits of the Employment Rights Bill that might mean it costs them a bit more, on top of obviously the budget recently and the national insurance going up as well. So in terms of forecasting, that's obviously something that's good to be looked at quickly, but it's not actually going to come into force for a little while.
Right.
Yeah, it's quite interesting again chatting to clients I work with. They're talking about the increase in the employer NI and the changes to the national minimum national living wage. And also I know we've got a bit of wiggle room with the eligibility criteria coming down as well, but it's quite a significant change. It's clients are starting to do the numbers now. They're starting to do the number crunching, and it's going to have quite an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly for, I mean, all employers really, but particularly those who have workers on a lower salary. I think the national minimum wage is going up, and then plus the national insurance as well. Yeah, it's going to have a big effect.
Yeah, and of course those that come out of the budget, which was a little bit after the employment bill. But I mean, I support quite a few charitable clients, and with the squeeze potentially on funding as well, this is quite significant. And actually, there's concern that it's going to place additional pressure on public services because a lot of charities are going to have to close. And actually, what they do is they take pressure off the public services to, provide services outside of the main national accessible services. So it's quite significant for the charitable sector.
Yeah. Amanda, can you walk us through what I know you mentioned at the beginning, some of the things in the Employment Rights Bill that's coming up, and what some of those, can you remind our listeners and those watching what they are and how it might affect employers in practice if they were to come into force?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously we had the unfair dismissal issue. There's going to be paternity leave going to become a day one right. So no need for the 26 weeks of service, and also parental leave becoming a day one right, which if you remember, this is the unpaid leave that parents get up to 18 weeks.
Yeah.
Going back to flexible working, which we discussed, they're making further changes there. So at the moment, you have to, if you're going to turn down a request, obviously you've got to consult with the employee, and then you give them a reason, and it's got to be one of the 8 statutory reasons. That's not changing, but now, or if it does come in, I should say, you'll have to justify that reason. So whereas before you could say whichever reason you've chosen, but now you've got to show why that's reasonable to have used that reason within the business. So it will be a little more tricky for employers to show that. Another big one is in relation to 0 hours contracts. So workers that aren't guaranteed many hours or not guaranteed any hours at all will have the right to be offered guaranteed hours. I think it's quite complex as to how it's going to work, and we don't have the full details, but I think they're going to have worked for a period of time, and then you use that period of time as a reference period and look at the average hours they've worked, and then the company will have to offer them a sort of permanent contract on those permanent hours, and then the employee gets to either decide to turn that down or to accept it. So they could carry on as 0 hours worker, but that would be up to the employee, not the employer.
Can I just want to ask a question on that, because that's quite interesting and it sounds far more confusing than the legislation that was due to come in, which was the right to request a regular working pattern, and that's been sidelined, hasn't it? So is this to replace that?
Exactly, yes. So we had the rights to predictable term, which was going to work kind of similarly to flexible working, where an employee could make a request if they've actually worked a set number of hours for a permanent contract, and it could be turned down on certain defined reasons. So very similar to flexible working. That was due to come into effect September, October this year, and then now that's been revoked. So that's going, but of course that's because the government under the Employment Rights Bill has created something that's actually stronger in terms of employees, in that they'll be able to not just request to have a permanent contract, but the employer will have to offer to them. And if it's turned down after a period of time, I think they have to offer it again based on the reference period. And it's not clear yet what that could be. It might be a 12-week average, it was discussed, but I think employers have been very unhappy with that, and particularly seasonal companies have been suggested 52-week average period would be fairer. So we'll have to see what happens there. And related to that as well, companies will also have to give employees notice, or a longer period of notice as to their shifts and their rotas. There's no laws around that at the moment. And of course, for some companies, they give the shifts or rotas very soon before as they cancel on employees, which obviously isn't very fair to the employee. So the process where you have to give them at least a certain period of notice for the rota. And if you do cancel shifts at the last minute, then there's going to be compensation that's got to be paid to the employees as well.
I think all those sounds really good from an employee's perspective who is on a 0-hour contract or on a temporary contract or something like that. But from an employer's point of view, especially in sectors that rely on these 0-hour workers and stuff, such as hospitality, retail, and the rest of it, it can potentially be quite a nightmare to manage.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. It's a big admin burden. And I think this is something where people can be planning ahead. Again, this isn't likely to come in anytime soon, probably not for 2 years. So I think companies should be looking at what they do at the moment, whether it's really necessary to keep people on 0 hours, or if there are people that do tend to work around about the same number of hours, whether it's worth offering them some guaranteed hours at least, because you might find that's better than the legislation that might be coming, where it's going to be very difficult to figure out what's happening. And as a big admin burden in terms of having to keep making these offers, doing the calculations of the average hours for lots of different employees all at different times.
Yeah, so it's a watch this space, and I'm sure there'll be lots of guidance from solicitors and like yourself, and from HR consultants when there's a bit more clarity around exactly what the bill entails and what employees need to do to be ready and to prepare for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I would expect the government as well to be also providing some more guidance. And yeah, it's very woolly at the moment. It's kind of an idea. They're consulting on it, so we don't have fixed reasons. And once the consultation's done, obviously they're speaking to employer representatives as well as trade unions, and we'll see what comes out in the end. And of course, again, this is one where the headlines were there's going to be no 0 hours at all. It's going to be banned, which is not the case.
With regards to the consultations, how can people get involved if they are interested?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I imagine if you go onto the government website, I know some of the consultations are already underway at the moment. So yeah, I would just go on the government website and see how you can do that. Whether you can do it as an individual, I don't know. You probably have to be part of some sort of organisation. But yeah, I think if people want to be involved and are worried about it and want to have their say, now's the time definitely to do it.
Probably checking out with their local chambers of commerce and stuff like that might also be a good route for most employees as well. So yeah, that's great. So what else is on the list? Exciting times.
It's a long list, I'm afraid.
Oh no, there's more.
Yeah, another big one's fire and rehire.
Oh yes.
Yes, again, a very headline grabbing one as well. And as we all know, sometimes when you're trying to bring through changes to employees' contracts, and when there's a whole group of them, of course, you always consult with them with a view to them agreeing. But as a last resort, sometimes if people don't agree, companies will essentially terminate their employment contract and then offer them a new contract on the new terms immediately after. This has become known as fire and rehire. So they are talking about making quite big changes to this. At the moment, there's no real regulation around it, only a code of conduct, but it's going to be a lot tighter. So the reasons that the company has for going through fire and rehire will basically have to be if there's a financial reason for the company that's so serious that the company maybe can't continue unless these changes are made. So it's going to be a very high bar, whereas of course at the moment people will make quite minor changes to contracts like shifts and things like that. So I think, again, this is something, it's probably going to be a while before it comes in, and for all of us it's always the last resort to do something like this anyway. But something that companies might be thinking about now is having flexibility in their employment contracts. So the type of things as to where it's sometimes used is in relation to hours of work, shift patterns, things like that. You could actually include clauses in the employment contract, and if they say in terms of your duties, this is your job role, however you'll be expected to do different things depending upon the company's requirements. Hopefully that would mean that you could just then use the contractual clause to make minor changes rather than having to go through the consultation and then potentially dismiss and rehire. So that could potentially be a way around it, but of course we don't know what the legislation is going to say, and the legislation might say you're not allowed to do that. But for now, it's worth doing, I think.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, although the rights are not here yet, employers can start thinking about how they can adjust their current contracts of employment to account for some of these changes that are anticipated. In a way that when the changes come in, hopefully depending on what it is and how they are prescribed or written, they will be covered already. But if not, then the shift won't be too big anyway, if they're taking the steps.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and that's the best we can do. But otherwise, it will become that fire and rehire can really only be used if the company's in dire straits, and it's the only option.
Yeah, that's good advice, actually, to think that through now. Yeah. I mean, fire and hire, I always think is quite a harsh sort of term for it. And I know there's been some very big cases in the press, like the P&O situation. But actually, with some of the smaller clients, what you find is that they're just looking to try and align terms or readjust terms with having staff on different terms that have come in from at different times and things. But obviously you still can't do it if you can't get agreement. So they don't really want to be in a fire and rehire situation. But, it's the only way sometimes to align terms, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, as you say, more often than not, it's about harmonisation.
Yeah.
And currently, depending on how different those contracts are, some employers I know, if it's a small amount of employees on there who refuse to sign the new contract or to agree to the harmonization, the term that we use in etc. Sometimes some employers just leave them on that contract and let things run its course for when they go through a promotion or change of role or whatever, then offer them the new terms and conditions. That is currently how some employers do it. But it's typically where the changes are so significant and very different to the current ones, where probably mostly these fire and rehire clauses or routes are taken, isn't it?
Sometimes, yeah. And often we know how it is. You can have hundreds of people in the consultation when it's a minor point, and most people will agree, but often there's that one or two people that don't like to agree for the sake of not agreeing. And I think sometimes that's the time when people will say, well, for those last couple, we will end their contract and start the new contract. But yeah, of course, in the future, that might not be possible anymore.
And for people listening or someone who's never actually implemented the fire and rehire before and think, oh, this is interesting, I can think of Mary. I can go in on Monday, have a conversation, and their contract and start a new one. What are the current circumstances under which an employer can effectively invoke or implement fire and rehire?
Yeah, so if you are going to make changes to contracts, of course, you want to try and agree it with the employer. That's step one. First of all, if you think anybody's not going to agree, then, and especially if there's lots of people, you should be having a consultation with everybody to explain why you will need to make the changes, how it's going to affect them, and then with a view to them agreeing and then signing a new contract. And this is really where you have that one or two people that won't agree. Whereas a company, you believe it's reasonable what you're offering. And therefore, if they don't agree, you end their contract, but only after giving them notice as required under their contract. And you offer them a new contract that would start immediately after the other one. So if this isn't a risk-free way of doing things by any means, it is a dismissal still in law, even though you've offered them a job to start immediately straight after, probably for the same salary and everything. But it is a dismissal, and so there is always a risk that the employee could claim unfair dismissal because of that. So this is why we do the consultation first, to show that we've acted reasonably to that point. And of course, you'd have to show to a tribunal that the new contract clauses were also reasonable, so that it was unreasonable for the employee to have turned them down to avoid unfair dismissal compensation.
What happens to the length of service of those employees who are dismissed and rehired in that instance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, exactly. But as they start the new job immediately after, they still keep their continuity of service. So that's
I think that is really important to highlight, because especially for somebody who might be thinking of, oh, we might have a redundancy or restructuring on the horizon, etc. It's not a get out of jail card for shortening people's length of employment. So
absolutely, yes, exactly, yes. Unless they had a break in service, at least over a week, then you would always still have that continuity of service. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. So why is it so controversial, the new bill, and what changes it's proposing? Why are some employers worried about the proposed changes?
So if we say at the moment, to use a sort of common example, say you have a factory and you have a certain shift pattern and things are going to change in the factory. So there's new machinery or something. It's just a different way of working slightly. And they need people to do a slightly different shift. So maybe they're still working 40 hours a week, but just slightly different times of the day. This is a really common example where, of course, you'd be consulting with everybody first, explaining, trying to reach agreement with them. But there may well be someone that says they're not happy to leave at 4 rather than 3:30 or something. At the moment, this is a common way that we would use the fire and rehire potentially as a last resort if there are some people that don't agree without good reason. Under the new legislation, under the Employment Rights Bill, if it does come in the form it is at the moment, you wouldn't be able to do it for that reason. Just for sort of efficiency reasons wouldn't be enough. It would have to be that potentially the company's going to go under unless we make these changes. And yeah, it's quite difficult to imagine situations where that's going to arise. I think it's going to be very rarely.
Yeah. Great stuff. Any other sorts of big ticketed item?
Absolutely. There's still plenty to go. But another big one, of course, is prevention of sexual harassment, which I don't think we've spoken about at all. So moving away from the Employment Rights Bill, but of course we already have the duty since, I think it's the 26th of October, for all companies to prevent sexual harassment. And as the law is at the moment, you've got to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. So of course, people at the moment should be looking at putting in place a policy in relation to harassment, particularly sexual harassment, making sure everybody's trained, particularly managers, as to how to deal with situations, and making sure that you've got really good reporting methods and that people know where they need to go if they need to report something, and processes to how to deal with it if instances do arise. Now, at the moment, the duty does say that it's about preventing sexual harassment in the workplace between your employees, but it also includes a duty to prevent sexual harassment by third parties.
Yeah.
However, at the moment, in the law as it stands now, the company doesn't have any liability for third party harassment. So the employee can't bring a claim against the company. So that's the position at the moment. Under the Employment Rights Bill, they're talking about extending the duty further, so that rather than having to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, you'd have to take all reasonable steps. What this means is a good question. And it's one of those things where we're not going to have a list of things that you must do. It's going to come down to case law, really. And whereas at the moment it's doing what's reasonable, arguably if you've got to do everything reasonable, that is obviously going to be much harder. And if there's anything at all that you could think of that might prevent sexual harassment, you should be doing it under the new bill if it does come in. Also, I think the biggest thing is that under the new bill, it suggests that there will be liability for third-party harassment. So this would be if you have customers, clients coming in, suppliers, contractors, any third party that the employees have contact with. If they sexually harass them, then the employer can be liable. So I say particularly for companies where there is lots of hospitality, retail, all sorts of things that you can imagine, it's going to be very difficult because, of course, you can't control other people. It's difficult enough to control your employees, let alone third parties, that you've got no real relationship with. So I think that's going to be a big change, and it's something that, of course, companies are going to be looking at their policies and training at the moment in relation to preventing sexual harassment. But I think they should be thinking that down the line, it might also include liability for third-party harassment, and really thinking about where your risks lie, and what you can do to prevent that.
And again, it's that really interesting use repeatedly of the word reasonable. That's quite ambiguous, isn't it? And that's going to, as you say, that's going to take some claims and some case law to iron out. And what all reasonable steps are for one business is going to be different to what all reasonable steps are for another organisation.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So it's very difficult to say you must do X, Y, and Z, because it is going to depend on your company. And we would say now you should be carrying out sort of risk assessment as to where the areas lie that things are most likely to happen, and what you can do to prevent it. And as we said, it's very difficult to control people. You can only do that so far, but I think a really important step is going to be what you do about it if something does happen, and someone brings a complaint. I think it's going to be very important to show that you took it seriously, dealt with it swiftly, etc.
I think that all reasonable steps and the liability hopefully would also make employers and leadership sit up a bit, because it's not going to be enough to say, oh, we've got a harassment policy that addresses this, or we've trained our staff, or we've trained. It really has to be all stakeholders who really employers need to consider how they are going to train people, make people aware, and also make it very clear their level of tolerance, which in any organization, regardless of what size, should be zero tolerance anyway. So it's really thinking about, in practice, like you both said, what does this mean for my business, for my stakeholders, and for my supply chain? Because that's what it comes down to. And I think I totally agree. You can't control everyone, but how you react when something happens is going to go a long way to send a message as a deterrent to others doing the same thing, I think, when these things happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, this is a positive thing, of course. It's a headache for employers to have to think about, but hopefully it means that there will be less instances of sexual harassment in the future, which can only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so anything else?
I think those are the big ones.
Oh, okay, that's good. As if that wasn't enough to be going on with.
I think we have covered a lot. And when we listen back to this, we'll know how many different points and legislation that we've covered within this short space of time. And rightfully so, each of them can be covered on a podcast on its own, so to speak. So we have covered a lot. But for anyone who is listening And we've grabbed their attention now. Right, there's a lot to be done. There's a lot I need to do. What should people be doing? I know we've touched on it here and there, but what should people be doing in practice, so employers especially, be doing to be ready for some of these changes coming into play? And actually, I think even if some of these don't come into play, thinking about some of them and implementing some of them will make your workplace a better place for people to work at, and also will help you with your staff retention, improving your culture and all those things anyway. So they are quite good things to think about. So what should they be doing to be ready?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. But I think the most important thing is about training overall. So obviously we've just talked about sexual harassment, and that involves training. But absolutely all staff should be getting trained so they understand what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and what to do about it. Not just if something affects them, but if they see something else happening to somebody else. Managers as well, how do they deal with these situations if somebody comes to them and says, this has just happened to me? Also, in relation to unfair dismissal and the fact that the 2 years of service is going to be going, here, I think training is going to be really important for managers who are dealing with people. As we said, the 2 years is not going to happen anymore. We're not going to be able to say, oh, they've not been here too long. It's quite easy to dismiss somebody. You're always going to have to follow some sort of process. So managers are going to need to know what that process looks like, what are the minimum requirements they need to do. And I think really embedding a culture of communication, and where issues arise, such as performance issues, not just leaving them because it's not nice to have difficult conversations, but empowering the managers to have that conversation early, sit somebody down, so that a process is started, so that if there are issues, hopefully it's nipped in the bud and improved. But if it can't be improved, at least you've started that process. And if it ends in dismissal, at least you've done what you need to do. Also flexible working as well. I think that it might be that more people start to request flexible working. Managers need to know again how to deal with that. And as I said before, you can't just pick one of the 8 reasons under the Employment Rights Bill, but you've got to show why that's reasonable. So again, I think this is just training the people, whether it's in HR or managers, that will be dealing with it as to how they do need to deal with that. And of course, as we touched on before, policies, these are always important in HR, whether it's about anti-harassment or capability policies, disciplinary policies, things like this as well. Of course, we'll have to look at, and look, we have plenty of time to do it. This isn't coming in overnight by any stretch. So we can be thinking about this, and I think just generally thinking about how you run your business, how you employ staff. As I say, if we can put some flexibility into employment contracts, if employees agree, that's great. Also, as I said, about 0 hours as well. If you've just had 0 hours contracts, but in reality, your staff mainly work, say, at least 20 hours or whatever it is a week, think about whether it's best to put them on some sort of permanent hours contract, because that's probably better than the new legislation where you have to keep on offering fixed hours.
Great stuff. So lots to be getting on with. Thank you very much. As always, your knowledge and expertise is always very welcomed, and we're always very grateful for you sharing that with us, and with our members and with our listeners. So thank you for doing that today. Definitely lots to be getting on with, Mary. We need to get on. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us for this year in review in employment law. We hope you found it useful and you've got some things to take away that you can start thinking about. If you would like to get in touch with us, please do hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. If you'd like to come on the podcast and talk to us or share some of your expertise or knowledge, we're always looking for guests, so please do get in touch. Thank you both very much, and we will see you again next time. Bye,
Right.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of HR Voices. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover or would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media or email us at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. Tune in next time.